The meeting is over. President Trump and Vladimir Putin held that first meeting today, 8 months, of course, after an election that the U.S. government determined was targeted by Russia. And this is the easy part, the talking part. Any president would be expected to lay down a rhetorical marker in the first meeting with an adversary after attempts to interfere with our democracy. And a president who ran on putting America first, a logical application of that slogan obviously requires putting America before Russia. But the Trump administration instead offered a very mixed message, suggesting that Donald Trump talked to Putin about Russian interference, but that the very interference itself was a question. Question is the key word in this breakdown of the meeting from none other than Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
With regard to the interference in the election, I think the president took note of actions that have been discussed by the Congress, most recently additional sanctions that have been voted out of the Senate to make it clear as to the seriousness of the issue. But I think what the two presidents, I think rightly, focused on is how do we move forward? How do we move forward from here? Because it's not clear to me that we will ever come to some agreed upon resolution of that question between the two nations. So the question is, what do we do now? And I think the relationship, and the president made this clear as well, is too important. And it's too important to not find a way to move forward.
Too important to not find a way to move forward. Notice that Tillerson is treating his ideological conclusion as some kind of universal preference, as if everyone thinks Russia is such an important partner that its attacks on the United States must be just swallowed. Of course, most American leaders have not taken that kind of approach as a given. From President Reagan to President Obama, most leaders have not rejected American intelligence and called its conclusions into question just to smooth over relations with this adversary.
Mr. Secretary, can you say if the president was unequivocal in his view that Russia did interfere in the election? Did he offer to produce any evidence or to convince Mr. Putin?
The Russians have asked for proof and evidence. I'll leave that to the intelligence community to address the answer to that question. And again, I think the president at this point, he pressed him and then felt like at this point let's talk about how do we go forward.
That's weird. Tillerson is literally saying the U.S. intelligence community should answer the Russians' questions about evidence, like our spies are answerable to the people they spy on, and they should provide evidence to the opponents they're accusing of these attacks. Why would you want to give the Russians any clues about how the intel community knows what it knows? In court, sure. American citizens have a right to see the evidence against them. This isn't a court. The Russians aren't honoring our rules, they're breaking them. And if this is any road to cyber war, something Dick Cheney himself suggested, well, you don't publicly tell your own intelligence officials, who of course risk their lives in these kind of wars, to brief the potential enemy. As for Tillerson's key word tonight, question, the government he serves already has the answer. Russia meddled in the election. The last administration announced it and acted on it. Congress, in a bipartisan manner, has acted on it. And Trump apparently brought it up today while also sowing more doubt about it. Illogical, that position, but perhaps predictable.
She's saying Russia, 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 but maybe it was. I mean, it could be Russia, but it could also be China. It could also be lots of other people. It also could be somebody sitting on their bed that weighs 400 pounds, okay?
She doesn't know if it's the Russians doing the hacking. Maybe there is no hacking.
Once they hack, if you don't catch them in the act, you're not going to catch them. They have no idea if it's Russia or China or somebody. It could be somebody sitting in a bed someplace.
Joining me now is David Philipp of Moscow Bureau Chief for the Washington Post from Hamburg, Germany. Michael McFaul, of course, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and MSNBC contributor. And Julianne Smith, Director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security, also a former National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. Ambassador, how unusual is this request that our folks provide the evidence to their folks? And who won the meeting?
Well, to your first question, it's very unusual. You're absolutely right. It's not the job of our intelligence community to share intelligence to somebody who violated our sovereignty, right? It's like as if a criminal came into your house and they stole your data, they stole your television set, and then the police are supposed to provide data to them about what they did. Putin knows what he did. Putin expected Trump to say something about it, and it appears, judging by the readout from Secretary Tillerson, that in fact he didn't push back very hard. Note that Tillerson said earlier in his remarks, he said the people of America are concerned when he read it out. He didn't say President Trump said he was concerned.
Are we overreading that? I mean, I've seen that observation because it's noticeable, but is it a problem?
You know, I worked at the White House for 3 years. I was in these meetings with both Prime Minister Putin at the time and President Medvedev. I never remember a kind of construction like that. I never remember a construction where it said, it was noted, right, past tense.
Yeah.
It was noted that the Senate is concerned about this. Why isn't President Trump concerned about this?
Right.
And I just think by answering it that way, this idea that we're just going to move along after our sovereignty has been violated, that's not in the American interest. That is a weak response to what Putin did last year.
Julianne, what did Putin get out of this, and why was the meeting so long?
Well, I think he wanted to get a smile. He wanted to extend the meeting so that they'd come out afterwards. There'd be a lot of questions about what was discussed. There'd be some confusion over who's reporting what. He wanted this to look like a fireside chat with some old friends. He needed that photo opportunity. He wanted to show that he could basically play President Trump, and I think he did just that. I think Trump came in unprepared. I don't think he was well briefed. I don't think his team readied him for this meeting. And I think the end result is that Putin got just about everything he wanted from that meeting, including a very light touch on Russian meddling in our election last fall. And that's a shame, because this issue is not going to go away, or this tactic on the part of the Russians. They're going to do this again. They did it in France most recently. They will likely do it in Germany this fall. And I would assume that they're going to do it in 2018 and 2020 in the United States again.
David, you know the old saying, don't know much about history. Rex Tillerson bringing up the chemistry between these two men for whatever reason. Take a listen.
The two leaders, I would say, connected very quickly. There was a very clear positive chemistry between the two. I think, again, and I think the positive thing I observed, and I've had many meetings with President Putin before, is there was not a lot of relitigating of the past.
David, would you consider it relitigating something that the two men have never discussed before? That's what we call a leading question, but I don't know how else to ask it.
Well, I mean, obviously the point of all this was to put all this behind it, put all this behind everybody and have a nice picture moving forward, right? So the American people see this picture of, you know, President Trump behaving dignified way with President Putin, and now we're all going to move forward. We're not going to think about that stuff anymore. This whole calculation is great for Russia and maybe great for people in the rest of the world. Americans who are really interested, like my two colleagues here on this panel, didn't get any answers. We didn't get any answers whatsoever. Is Putin going to have to answer for what he did? Does President Trump really believe that this election hacking happened? But for the people who don't care, they got a great picture of them kind of like wrapping it up. Okay, that was too bad about that. Let's move on.
I mean, Ambassador, yeah, some people don't care by definition. Then I guess
well, they should care.
They might not see the photo in the first place.
Yeah.
But last time I checked, the American public does have issues with Russia. I suppose some of the partisan lines of this are changing if Putin is a stand-in for the Republican Party. But that shift hasn't completely occurred, and this would be oddball in the extreme to suggest that it's a win for a U.S. president to back off an adversary.
Yeah, and let's be clear about when Secretary Tillerson is saying the two leaders said we should just move on and forget about the history, forget about the agenda. What is that agenda? That agenda is created by Vladimir Putin. He's the one that intervened in our elections. We didn't do that. He did that to us. He's the one that annexed territory in Ukraine. He created that as an agenda item. We didn't do that. He's the one that doubled down and tripled down in his support for Assad in Syria. 500,000 people have died there. That agenda is created by him. So, surprise, surprise, he wants to move on. That is not smart diplomacy. Diplomacy is not a popularity contest.
Right.
Diplomacy is about defending America's national interest and defending international interest. Thou shalt not interfere in elections in other countries. That's principle number one. Thou shalt not annex the territory of thy neighbor. Principle number two, we just can't forget about those events. We have to make sure they don't happen again.
And Julianne, the Russian foreign minister then basically stakes out this dramatic ground. This was a headline breaking all afternoon with some pushback, as we've noted, but saying, oh, yeah, and the Trump took Putin at his word. Take a listen.
President Trump has said that he has heard clear declarations from Mr. Putin that Russian leadership and Russian government has not interfered in the elections, and he accepts these the things that Mr. Putin has said.
And what's going on there?
Well, this doesn't surprise me at all that we have two conflicting versions of the meeting, and that's why the U.S. team, everyone should have agreed to bring in more staff, note takers. I know Mike McFaul, when he was part of the administration as ambassador or as senior director for Russia, he himself would be in a meeting like that to provide a readout to the press afterwards. We now only have the four principals that were in this meeting with two translators. The translators are obviously not going to share their notes. And so we're left with the question, who's telling the truth? Do we believe the U.S. administration, President Trump's version of the story, or President Putin's version of the story? And neither one of these guys are known to be honest Abe.
Right.
I mean, they both have trouble with the truth, obviously.
Right,
so,
honest Vladimir. I mean,
yeah.
A subsidiary question to what you're saying then is also, what are the foreign policy implications of Russia if they are lying about the meeting, feeling that they can lie about the word of the President of the United States, apparently unconcerned about any reaction, which, again, if you're for America first and being tough, I would assume one of the benefits of being tough is countries don't get away with lying about what you said moments after you said it. David, going back to you, this is how the New York Times put it, that they were trying to prevent exactly this kind of thing. I guess maybe it didn't work. Quote, the Russians had agitated to include more staff in the meeting. Trump's team had insisted the meeting be small, avoid leaks and competing accounts later. And that was someone speaking on the condition of not admitted because of the sensitivity. But we have competing accounts, no?
Yeah, and I mean, we obviously were thinking all day about what was going on there. You know, Ivanov also threw out American reporters from that briefing, like myself, even though the thing was broadcast live on Russian channels. You know, there's an attempt in Vladimir Putin's presidency to whitewash the past, to make things a lot smoother, to present a view of the world that, hey, Russia's just a country that's trying to get along. We're not really trying to interfere in anybody's elections. And this press conference by Ivanov and the corresponding one by Tillerson really played towards that. Why President Trump needs that is something that is harder to understand. But what the Russians were trying to do was push this whole thing forward. And that statement by Ivanov, that's just basically saying, hey, we confirm everything we've been saying. There was no, hacking, and the U.S. president agrees with it. And we'll be really asking tomorrow everybody we know in Washington, does President Trump, did he really accept this? Did he really say that? Because it sounds insane. It sounds out of this world that he would just go and put it away like that with the entire country, interested in this investigation.
Ambassador McFaul, I have the final question for you, and it may be the hardest to answer. Going forward, is the Trump administration taking the position that Russia either didn't meddle or it barely mattered, so it's all good? Or is there a view that to the extent they meddled, it was to help Trump? So he doesn't really need to prevent it because it could help him again in the re-elect.
Well, I don't know the answer to that, obviously. I wasn't in the meeting. By the way, I used to negotiate who would be in those meetings, +1, +2, +3. I had assumed that the Russians kept the Americans out. If this reporting by the New York Times is true, that raises serious doubts about the relationship that the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, has, that the president doesn't even want his National Security Advisor in the room for fear of leaks. That's a big problem.
Right, because he wouldn't be leaking if it's working, if the thing's working.
There's only 3 people. I mean, that to me is very disturbing. I hope we learn more about that. To your question, I don't know the answer with respect to how President Trump's thinking, but I do know the answer with respect to how Russia is going to behave. It is naive beyond imagination to assume that the Russians or the Chinese or somebody in the future is going to only hack, is going to only interfere in our elections on the side of the Republican Party.
Right.
That is crazy. So rather than debate about his legitimacy or not, that's why he doesn't want to talk about it, we need to treat this as a national security issue and get ready so that this doesn't happen again.
Ambassador McFaul, Julianne Smith, I want to thank you both, and a special thank you to David Filippov. The reward for good work is more work, and you stayed up till 4 in the morning with us. I appreciate it, your local time.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.